Welcome everyone to the Inspira Advantage webinar on crafting your application narrative. Thank you all for joining us on a Wednesday evening. We have two great panelists with us who are application consultants with us at Inspira Advantage, where we help med school candidates and those looking to get into other medical related post-grad programs with their application and really every part of the application process. All right, so let's dive in. So we'll introduce our two panelists tonight. We'll talk about what an application narrative is, how to go about determining your application narrative, how to ensure you tell a cohesive story. We'll give some tips on developing an impactful application as a whole, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A. So if you have questions throughout this webinar, feel free to pop those into a Q&A box, and we will definitely get to those at the end. So we have Callie and Neil with us today. They've both been a part of many webinars and are truly wonderful to have. They have a ton of great information, and I'm excited that they can be here to talk about the application narrative with you all. Callie, can you introduce yourself?
Hi there, thank you so much. So I'm Callie. I'm currently a fourth-year medical student at Yale, where I've served on the admissions committee, and I applied into psychiatry for residency.
Great, thanks so much for being here. Neil, can you introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, hey guys, I'm Neil. I've been with Inspira for a little while now. I went to the University of Michigan for medical school, and now I'm a PGY2 dermatology resident at NYU.
Great, and thank you as well for being here. So let's talk about what an application narrative is. Callie, you want to start us off here?
For sure. So your application narrative is essentially this story that you're telling throughout the entirety of your application. And it's pretty much all aspects of what you're trying to get your application to communicate. And it's really, really, really important to have a cohesive narrative. We'll get into this throughout the talk, but there are a bunch of different parts of the application, and they can feel a little bit scattered and disjointed. And it isn't necessarily intuitive that you need to connect this all into like wrapping it up together with a bow into one package that's easily digestible to show that you have a story in terms of what brings you to medicine, what you want to do in medicine, and why you're qualified to be doing these things.
Great. Neil, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that pretty much covers the basics, and I think we're going to go into a lot more detail in just a bit.
All right. So how to go about determining your application narrative. So let's talk about the components of an application.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is pretty important to understand first off, just because it's good to know, how much is involved, I guess, before you start determining where to put what. So to start off, there's the primary application, which is basically the first step in submission. It's a catalog of a lot of the things you did to get you to this point in applying to medical school, and it's kind of the first step that medical schools can see that allows them to send you the secondaries and so on. So it'll include some background information. It'll include some coursework, official transcripts from your school, work and activities, letters of evaluation from people who know you well, or who you feel like can strongly speak to your character or your academic performance, for example. It'll include the personal statement and some that you've had on your path to medical school. The secondary application, again, medical schools can only send you after you submitted the primary application, so it's important to get that primary application in as soon as possible. The conventional wisdom that I was told when I was applying was literally the first day it opens, try to get that primary application in. and that seems to work well. The reason, just to maybe go on a little bit of a tangent, is that medical schools often operate on rolling admissions. So the quicker they can see your application and send you the secondary, the quicker they can interview you, and the higher chance you have of getting a spot. And that leads into the interview, which is sort of the final step or checkbox before a medical school can give you that acceptance.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing else to add here.
Perfect. So how to start developing your narrative. So knowing that you have to compile all of those different pieces of your application through a multi-month long period. Let's talk about how to create a story that will be able to string through all of those.
Yeah, so, okay, I'll get into a slight tangent first before getting into this, but it's saying to ask yourself the following, and really the purpose of having an application narrative is not only to communicate to admissions committees who you are, but to also make sure that you know who you are and that you know why you're doing this and that you have thought through like your you're almost like your mission statement for why you want to do medicine and what specifically you want to do. So if you find throughout this advice that you are kind of struggling, like why do I want to do this? That's okay. That's time for you to reflect. But these are answers that you need to have in order to like even know for yourself that medicine is what you want to do. So I'll get off my soapbox and keep going here now. But it's important to ask yourself, like, what qualities and traits do you have that make you a good physician, how you have the experiences to back these up and demonstrate them, and then what are your strengths and weaknesses in regarding being a physician and regarding the specific narrative that you are choosing.
I'm going to pop in here and just say a lot of this goes into answering the why do you want to be a doctor question, which is very much goes hand in hand with that building your application narrative. We do have a webinar on that we did last week, and you can find that on our YouTube channel and on our website if you want to dive into that a little bit more, but it complements this one very well. But I will pass it back to Callie and Neil. Neil, do you have anything else to add to this, or Callie?
No, I totally agree. And I think this is something we harped on last week as well, is that it's important, when you're doing this process, it's sort of like a finding yourself in a way too. Like you'll find, I think, and a lot of people do, that once you've sort of cataloged all these ideas, organized them, you have a better sense of who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. And it's kind of an enlightening experience. So it's pretty fun.
Great. All right.
Yeah.
So the AAMC's 15 core competencies.
Yeah, an exhaustive list for sure. These are things that the AAMC, or the exact acronym is escaping me a little bit, but something about American in Medicine. It really wants you to be able to know or be competent in before you finish medical school. So these are things like service orientation. They want you to be able to give back to your community. Social skills, pretty important if you're trying to be a physician for most specialties, I guess, maybe not all of them. That you are able to interact with other people, other members of your team as part of a healthcare team. Cultural competence, being aware of socioeconomic conditions that may be impacting your patient's care or health. Teamwork, oral communication, these are things that you've probably worked on, your whole life, probably not just for medical school. Ethical responsibility to self and others should be, sort of a given, but is important to demonstrate when you're applying to medical school. Reliability and dependability. I think this is something that can come across best maybe through your letter writers. They can kind of speak to these qualities better than maybe a written application could. Resilience, adaptability, and a capacity for improvement. I think these are all things that you can sort of sell the medical school committee on yourself. Like you can write all of these things out. You can demonstrate through how you describe your activities, your work up to this point, that you are resilient, that you have the capacity to improve. But these are all things I want to see in your application, and the things that you should be focusing on demonstrating in that primary application.
Well said.
All right, here's a couple more of those.
Yeah, so there's thinking and reasoning competencies. So your ability for critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, scientific inquiry, and written communication. Some of these will come all across more in terms of like the content of what is in your application, in terms of like your grades and your like research that you've done and things like that. But what you still need to be able to write about these things and be able to show that you like learning and thinking and want to be a lifelong learner. And some of this really gets into it more in secondaries and interviews as well. And then for science competencies, so like living systems and human behavior, this is really emphasizing like the coursework, the MCAT. They're less so usually what people choose to write about during the like narrative parts of the application.
All right, so identifying a main theme.
So yeah, this is something we kind of mentioned briefly in the previous slides, but a lot of this is kind of about selling yourself, right, to the medical school. You have to make yourself stand out a little bit from the massive crowd of people that are vying for the exact same spot that you are. And you have to tell them, why you would be the fit for their medical school that they're looking for. A lot of this may and should kind of come from your personal experiences. What makes you unique? What's your unique path to medical school? And maybe tie that into their mission statement that kind of serves as the theme for your essays, or the way you write. So, you should kind of try to connect with what the school wants to hear, and you can kind of find out a lot about what that is from their website, for example, talking to students, talking to even faculty. But you all want that to come together in a cohesive way to, really answer the question, what is it about you that makes you the ideal candidate?
Yeah. And I think it's also just really important with your main theme that you have the experiences to back it up. Like if you hypothetically say like my main thing is that I want to work with like refugee populations and work at like a Hispanic primary care clinic in my like future career. You don't need to know this, by the way. Like you don't need to know what specialty is like your theme by any means. But let's say if you said that and then had no experiences to back it up, that doesn't seem super believable. Look at what you've done in terms of your activities. That can be a really helpful place to figure out what exactly your main theme is going to be, assuming that you've done activities that you care about and are passionate about and are what has driven you to medicine, which is much recommended to do.
So it sounds like this is very much the main theme of why you want to be a doctor and why you would be good in this profession. And then you are taking that and using that as a lens to view the rest of your application.
Yeah.
Great. All right, organizing your thoughts.
Yeah, so using your competencies, experiences, and your main theme as anchors, you can start piecing bits of your application together. And so again, you have your experience, like you have these three things that you're trying to like tie together. And it's really helpful, especially in the personal statement, that you have kind of a thread that you weave throughout, which is also relevant for the whole application, but like especially in the personal statement is where you can do a lot of the like heavy lifting on that.
Any other thoughts there, Neil?
No, I think this is a super important step, because there are going to be a ton of things you've done leading up to this point. It's basically a culmination of most of your life, probably, high school, undergrad, especially. And it's going to be hard to remember, all of the things you did, all the details about the things you did, in a way that's going to be able to allow you to write about them well. So I think organizing is something that should be done proactively. I think, even let's say you're thinking about the things that you've done, making a list, anytime a thought pops into your head or a detail pops into your head about one of the activities you've done or a leadership role you've taken, just jot it down so you kind of have it all listed out. And then you can find a way to piece or group them, maybe categorize them in a way that kind of fits a puzzle that eventually makes the picture or the
Yeah.
application in general.
So let's talk about ensuring that your application tells a cohesive story.
Yeah. So, the whole point of this application, I think that we've kind of repeated a couple of times, is, showing everyone what your journey to medical school was, and showcasing how it's unique. People love stories. I think that's just a fact of life, a fact of humans. Everyone loves a good story. So I think it's important to be able to tell a good story if you want it to stick in our minds. When we're reading through tons of applications, it's stories that we latch onto that help us root for you in the committee meetings later on. And they're a different way to tell stories, right? It may be like one big event that kind of catalyzed your drive to pursue medicine, and everything else sort of built on it. But maybe it was a stepwise sort of ladder that started in one place, another event built on it, another event built on it, and a whole bunch of choices and experiences kind of led you meantime helped you grow as a person. So you could kind of weave all of these things in together to create a narrative that sort of sticks in the reader's mind. And whenever you're telling a story, you do want it to lead somewhere, of course. So you should try to lead them to something that makes sense about why you want to pursue medicine at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah, because you really want to be memorable. I mean, in a positive way, obviously, but like you don't want to just seem like bland, like, oh, I really like science class. My parents really want me to be a doctor. Figured I'd do this. Like that is very bland and like actively not helpful. What you want is to be able to say, like, I like have these specific goals. I have these experiences to back it up. This has been my path to medicine. And it doesn't have to be a linear path. It doesn't have to be, especially if you're someone who's taken time off since undergrad, that can even strengthen your journey to medicine, showing that you tried something else and realized medicine is really where it's at for you. That is very compelling.
Thank you both. All right, Callie, illustrating your experiences.
Yeah. So in terms of like viewing your application as a movie, you want to make sure that you have developed as a main character throughout. And so this is really about showing how your experiences have shaped you. And something that you're going to hear us say a lot and that you've definitely heard before is show, don't tell. Like use specific anecdotes. That's incredibly important in your personal statement and in especially like your most meaningful activities where you get a little bit more space to write. A personal statement, often you want, like, if you can have an anecdote about a patient experience that really moved you and showed and like helped solidify that medicine is what you want to go into. That can be really helpful. And also like in your activities, if it was like a volunteering or whatnot, having a story that shows like is representative of larger themes that you can expand on. It's not like a resume where you just list bullets or anything like that, or have it like really streamlined. You want this to be narrative and like expanding on it using very specific details and instances.
Well said. Any other thoughts, Neil?
No, I love the movie reference as well. I mean, I think it's such a good way to think about it. And for me, I'm super visual. I may be biased, but I think most people love it when you illustrate things, when you really paint the picture. So I totally agree with what you said.
Absolutely. All right. Talking about gaps in your resume.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like there's in some ways a taboo on this when medical students ask about it. They think that some have strong opinions one way or the other. They should never talk about it. I think they should talk about all of them. I think there's a fine line probably, and when talking about gaps in your resume. But I think what's important if you decide to talk about gaps in your resume is to talk about things that you have demonstrated a conscious effort to bounce back from or to improve upon. And if you think about it, going off the same movie example or story example, the best stories are the ones where people face some sort of challenge or some sort of obstacle that they overcome eventually. And those are the ones that are pretty memorable to us too, where we really root for the main character. So I think it's not a bad idea to talk about gaps in your application if they exist. It is equally as important to talk about how you overcome them or how you sought to address those moving forward. Talking about how you learned from them. And in medicine in general, being vulnerable, honest, these are important characteristics, not just for your patients, but for yourself. And being able to bounce back from adversity is pretty important because medicine's not super easy. Sometimes there's some pretty tough spots, but it does require that you persevere through all of those rough spots and hold yourself accountable for your mistakes.
Yeah, very well said. And I will say that even if you're someone who's like, oh, my application is fine, there's no big deficits here, nothing, no red flags. First off, great, awesome. But second off, you still need to be thinking about these things in order to be able to write about them in secondaries and when they come up in interview questions about times that you've failed or made a mistake or overcome an obstacle, things like that. So it still becomes part of your application at some point.
Absolutely. All right,
All right.
considering the whole application.
Yeah, so you really want to zoom back or zoom out and think about, what picture am I trying to paint overall? And how can I make this impactful as a whole? You really don't have, I know it feels like a lot of writing when you're doing it, but you really don't have that much space to tell your story. And so it's really important to make sure that you're kind of dividing and conquering when you've decided what, themes you want to portray, what competencies you want to portray, what experiences you want to talk about. Figuring out where you can talk about it in all of them. So maybe some of them you ask a letter writer to highlight a story. Maybe something you talk about in the personal statement, something you talk about in your activities, wanting to make sure that you have it kind of evenly weighted across the things that you want to get across and don't have it be redundant on some things while skipping over others.
So I'm hearing you shouldn't necessarily be putting the same thing in two different parts of the application. You should strategically use all of the application pieces as ways to convey different parts of your story.
Yeah, you don't want anything to be redundant. Things can echo each other, and things to a certain level should echo each other if you're having a cohesive story. Your letter writer shouldn't talk about something that makes no sense in context of everything else that you've done, right? But you don't want there to be, if you're really redundant, it feels like it's fluff and it feels like you're just trying to get to a page limit, and that can be seen through really, really easily.
Great. Any other thoughts there, Neil?
Yeah, I totally agree. I actually think it's very underrated how important the rest of the application is. I think everybody centers on the personal statement and puts a lot of effort into the personal statement. I think that's a given. I think one way to make yourself stand out is to put a lot of effort into the small things, right? You have to fill out a ton of experiences and they give you a few sentences, which may not seem like a lot, but you can really bring across a lot of information through those few sentences if you structure them well. And I employed this both when I was applying to medical school as well as residency. And it's one of the positive pieces of feedback I got a lot of the time was, I felt like before even reading your personal statement, I had already sort of read your personal statement because I knew a lot about you. And then the personal statement was sort of just like a window into your life. In the interview, I could ask about whatever I wanted because I felt like I knew you as a person. So, I mean, I think when you write your personal statement, you're going to feel like you run out of room to write everything that you want. But it's important to consider that you can, like Callie said, strategically place pieces of information in other parts of the application, which will kind of help you bring the entire story together. So don't neglect the small parts of the application. Is my biggest piece of advice there.
Much agreed.
Definitely a good piece of advice. All right, so we'll talk about some tips for developing an impactful narrative, and then we'll open things up for Q&A. So as we get ready for that, pop some questions in the Q&A box, and Callie and Neil are here to answer them for you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of these things are going to be a review, but it's very important to be honest during the whole process. I mean, not just during the primary application, secondary application, during the interviews as well. One, you can get in a lot of trouble if they do find out that you have not been honest. But maybe that shouldn't be your main motivator. I think it's important to be honest to yourself as well, you know, when you're filling out this application. And I think it's not super hard for us to tell when you're not being honest. I mean, people who have done things and can talk about them with great enthusiasm do so in a way that's completely different than someone who's just fabricated hours on their application. It's not super hard to tell the difference, I guess I would say. And your enthusiasm really comes through when you care about something that you're doing. Again, you should avoid redundancy, like Callie talked about previously, and try to expand on things when you're talking about new pieces of information. Like, for example, when you are talking about a new experience or one of the experiences on your application, I think it's important each time to talk about, you know, why you did it, what you did, what you learned from it or took away from it, because I think that kind of shows greater insight into who you are and sort of expands on what could be a very boring single sentence description of some experience that you had. You should always show, don't just tell. I think that kind of ties into the previous point. Sort of paint a picture of, you know, what was going on, why you did it, and why it mattered to you, rather than just putting in the Google copy and paste description of the social justice in American Medical School Society or American Medicine Society. And it's okay not to be perfect. I mean, I think we all realize that as humans. You know, you don't have to be the applicant that never had anything that went wrong. I mean, we all applied to medical school. We all, as humans, have made mistakes or things have gone south, but we had to come back from them and end up where we are today. So I think it's important to be able to share those moments, but also share how you learned from them or how you rebounded from them, because I think that's the most important part of the journey, is being able to get back up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said.
Any other thoughts there, Callie, before we move on to a Q&A?
I guess also, I think just, I guess I mentioned this before, but just to like really highlight it, really try to have a thread that's woven throughout your entire application. Like, I know I've said that before, but you really having like a really disjointed application that's just full of like checkboxy things is not particularly memorable. You want someone to be able to say, oh, this person who did X, Y, who's been through this, who cares about this is the person I'm advocating for during an admissions committee meeting. You want you to be able to have like a one-liner about yourself that summarizes everything. So you're more complex and nuanced than a one-liner, but you want your application to be able to like be easily synthesized into like one or two main themes.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think before we go into Q&A, it might be good if Callie and Neil, you can give maybe just like a high level example of what, if done correctly, a cohesive application narrative might look like. Just very generic way just to like put all of these pieces that we've talked about together?
Sure. So, let's say you are an applicant with a strong interest in global health and serving underserved communities. And that's sort of your tagline, I guess, going into the application process. That's going to be your theme. I think it's going to be really important to support that in the rest of your application, right? So your primary or your personal statement may read something like, the first time I went to Honduras, I, interacted with such and such patient. It really inspired me to do more in much more flowery language, I'm sure. And you go into a couple more experiences, highlight 2 or 3 that are also related, even tangentially to your interests or to your path to medicine, and then finish with a strong concluding paragraph about, summarizing maybe in 1 or 2 sentences those experiences and how they drew you to where you are and what you'll bring to the medical school. The experiences in the rest of the application should reflect a commitment to serving underserved populations, whether that's, teaching kids in underserved societies about health literacy or curbing obesity in urban populations, as well as maybe global health, taking a mission trip at least, once, at least sometime, to show that you've actually made an effort to contribute to global health in the past. And then in each of those experiences, really telling people why you did what you did exactly, and what you learned from it. And then all of that together sort of creates a theme, right? That this is the person who is going to come into my medical school and who's going to really catalyze our desire to push global health forward. So that kind of makes you fit a niche, maybe that medical school is trying to fill. Does that sort of answer your question, Callie?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was perfect.
Yeah. All right, I'll take a stab at this. So I think for an applicant whose tagline is someone who's interested in rural health, I think that, a picture that could be painted is like, let's say this person grew up like on a farm in a very rural community, or barely like very widespread community, that they have seen firsthand the effects that happen when people have limited access to healthcare, when there's like low health literacy, when there are like substance use disorders running rampant, lack of like physicians even in the area, being able to paint a picture of what it was like to grow up with that, and then showing like a commitment to addressing this through the activity. So whether or not that be like volunteering in some kind of like perhaps like telehealth kind of like thing that like allows like physicians from the outside to like see people in this rural community, whether that be also just talking about like growing up doing farm chores. Like you might not think that's like related to medicine, but like it is, like it in the context of this story. And I think that if you and then like painting perhaps like personal like when you like working with patients, saying like, oh, they had a condition that should have been caught 10 years ago, and they've been living with it because of lack of access to healthcare providers, like stigma like against seeking out healthcare within rural communities, and like addressing all these like nuanced perspectives and saying that like they want to be the person that bridges this gap between rural communities and health. And so like that is another not so dissimilar narrative that could be painted.
Absolutely. I think that was great. And 2 different narratives that really are 2 very different narratives, but with them, you're able to really use your entire application as a way to supplement your main theme. All right. So feel free to pop in a Q&A question. We'll just start with Callie and Neil. Do either of you have any additional pieces of advice that we haven't covered here today on crafting your application narrative, or something that you wish you had known when you were crafting your applications?
Here's just one additional piece of advice I have, and this is, I think, general to creating the entire application, is just bounce the ideas off of other people. It may sound pretty good in your head, but once you tell somebody, it may sound really weird. So I think it's important to get a few perspectives, and not just from like one close friend, right? Like really a few, talk to a couple of people, trusted advisors, and get their feedback on your story and if it makes sense to them.
Yeah.
Definitely a good piece of advice.
I think another piece of advice is like, it's okay to be personal in a personal statement, or like in your application. And that also, it's okay to like be a little outside the box. And I mean both of these like with limitations, like you can take these too far. But I think that like what is considered relevant to medicine is a much broader thing than what people think of when they think of like pre-med stuff, like what you're supposed to put in the application. Like, for example, I didn't include waitressing over the summers to pay for college in my med school application because I didn't think that was relevant. And looking back on it now, like, oh my goodness, how did I leave that out? That it like shows a lot of like character on my part, but also like waitressing is remarkably not that dissimilar from being a doctor in terms of like juggling all these different like certain like needs of all these different people at the same time. And like regardless, like put the experiences that you have and like just take the things that you've done and the things that you care about, and then try to think like, is this related to medicine? Because it probably, there is a way to spin it in that it is. Medicine is so broad and so diverse that it doesn't have to just be like vice president of the pre-med club in order to be relevant. In fact, that's all like it, you stand out more if you have things that other people don't have.
That's a really great piece of advice, and something that is definitely overlooked and not something that's talked about enough. All right, well, I think that brings us to the end today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We're going to send out an email tomorrow that has the recording of this webinar, and some more information about Inspira Advantage as a whole. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, if you want to schedule a free consultation with our team and learn how people like Callie and Neil can help you on your application journey. Callie and Neil, thank you so much for being here. As always, your input is truly fantastic and so helpful. I hope everyone has a really great evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Good luck, everyone.